Okay, so we're going to be going over the rest of the lease. John said he left off at section 15. So I'm going to share the screen here. Share. Now do you guys see my dot loop?
Yes.
Okay, so let's open up the lease here and we'll scroll down to 15. Did you guys have any questions if you were on it last time before we get into the section he's talking about, or? Okay, so let's move this over a little bit. There we go. Okay, so section 15 here talks about tenant repairs and maintenance. So it's explaining essentially what the tenant is responsible for when it comes to repairs. So section A here talks about how they're responsible for paying for repairs that they cause, any damage that they cause that may have been from neglect from them, from their family, guest visitors, anything like that that they could have controlled. It does say that sewer and plumbing problems are included if they're caused by the tenant. So if, say, the sewer backs up, that wouldn't necessarily be the tenant's fault. But if they were doing something to cause that, then that would be their fault. B talks about maintaining the property, right, so that it's safe and clean. C, cutting the grass and things of that nature. Now, sometimes in the provisions, it might say that the landlord has a landscape company that is going to be coming, and that's part of their lease, that the tenant's going to be paying for the landscape company to do that. So it's important to know, is your tenant responsible for the grass, right, to cut the lawn, or is that something the landlord's taking care of for a fee? Driving and putting their vehicles only in the designated areas. So that would be something that you would think would be really obvious, but you never know sometimes. So don't drive on the lawn, right? Don't park your cars on the lawn. They should be in the driveways or on the street, or if, say, there's designated parking spots. If it's a condo, they have their assigned spots. They should be taking good care of all the equipment and fixtures in the property, making sure that they change the filters and things like that for the furnace to keep the life expectancy of the furnace. They should be notifying the landlord of anything that needs to be repaired. So if there's something that is breaking down, they should be notifying their landlord. They should be using all of their facilities in a safe manner, making sure that they're removing garbage and recyclables and putting them in the right place. So making sure that they bring the garbage out on the days it's supposed to be going out, putting the right things out. One of the things on here it says is they shouldn't be engaging in any activity that could cause the landlord to lose their insurance coverages. So you just have to make sure that, most tenants aren't really going to do anything like that, but make sure that they're not doing anything that would essentially be illegal for like a homeowner's insurance policy.
What happens if they do?
So if they do lose their insurance policy, then the landlord could essentially go to litigation, I guess, with them over it, if they can prove that it was due to the tenant that they lost it. It gets a little hinky there because then it becomes like a proof type of thing. And the only way the landlord would know something like that is if they're doing, say, like pop-bys or something, just to kind of check in on them. Because otherwise, how would you know if they're doing something that would lose your insurance, right? Unless you've visited the property. They should be using the electricity and the receptacles the right way. So not, overloading, say, an outlet with something. That way they don't cause any kind of fire, any kind of electrical outage. If there's any instructions or manuals, things that they should be following for the appliances, equipment, anything else for the property. For condo associations, you'll have bylaws, right? They should be following all of those. Of course, they should be doing nothing to destroy the property. And they should follow anything when it comes to the Board of Health, right? So they shouldn't be doing anything in the property that would go against the Board of Health. They should essentially be trying to get along with their neighbors, right? So not doing anything actively to cause any frustration with the neighboring properties. And unless the landlord and the tenant agree, they shouldn't change any of the landscaping. They should be keeping the walkways and the driveways clean from snow, dirt, things like that. Again, when it comes to snow, that would be whatever the agreement is between the landlord and the tenant, whether or not the landlord, say, has a company that comes to plow the snow the same way they have a company come to mow the lawn. Or if, say, you're in a condo association and maybe the condo association has people come and they do those, like they plow the parking lots, things like that. So they just need to make sure they know what their responsibilities are when it comes to snow and grass. And then the last one says they should comply with the rules and regulations that are published from time to time by the landlord. So again, if there are bylaws for the association, because I know condo rentals are very popular around here. If the landlord has any other kind of rules that they should be following. Now, they all have to be within reason, right? The landlord can't just say you can't have more than 3 people in your house, like, so they have to be like rules within reason. For the landlord repairs, they say how the landlord is responsible for any repairs to any kind of vital facilities for the property. So things like the furnace and the AC, plumbing, electrical systems, things that make the property run. It does say that the tenant could be responsible for the cost of the repairs, but it depends on the above section. So it depends on if they caused the problem. If they caused the problem, then they're going to be responsible for it. For 17, it talks about access to the property. So this talks about how the landlord should have access to the property as long as they give reasonable notice to the tenant. So that way they can inspect it, make sure everything's working the way it should be working. If they do have to repair something, they need to be able to get into the property to repair it. Or if they hire somebody to do it, say a plumber, the plumber has to be able to get into the property to repair it. If, say, they're selling the property, this is where a lot of agents have some frustrations. If the owner, the landlord, is selling the property, but there's still currently a tenant, as long as the tenant is provided notice, reasonable notice, they need to provide access to the property. You can ask a lot of the O'Brien agents. This tends to be difficult to attain because sometimes tenants are annoyed that they're having to move out, right? So they make it very difficult to show the property. So just make sure they understand that if the property is being sold, as long as they're giving notice, they are required to provide access to the property. Let's see down here, 18. So 18 talks about alterations to the property. So this is saying that your tenant can't alter or change the property without having written consent from the landlord. So, for example, carpeting, painting, changing the floors, anything that's gonna be, fixed to the property, right? So like the floor, if they change the floor, you can't just quickly change that. That's something that's affixed to the property. It also could damage, depending on who's doing it, could damage things, right? So unless the landlord gives written consent, you shouldn't be doing that. They shouldn't be installing any extra locks or guards without permission. They shouldn't be doing anything to the walls with wallpaper, things like that, that will damage them. Now they can hang up photos, but most times if you hang up photos or you hang up artwork, things like that, it's their responsibility to patch it up, right, before they leave. Or a TV, if they hang a TV, right, then it's their responsibility to patch it up. They shouldn't be installing or changing any electrical, plumbing, heating, or air cooling situations. So if, say, the property doesn't have any central air, they shouldn't be putting it in without any kind of permission from the landlord. If they do decide to paint, they have to have the landlord's permission on the colors too. So if say they wanted to paint the outside of the house and they wanted to paint it gray, they need to show the color to the landlord and get the permission from the landlord that that color is acceptable. If they're in an association, right? Associations have specific guidelines on what colors you can use and things of that nature when it comes to their houses in the association a lot of times. So they definitely have to make sure that if the landlord agrees to let them paint, that they get the color approved. And then the tenants also should be repairing anything which they have, like we said, pictures or TVs, anything on the walls where you might have made a hole for a nail or a screw. They should have them repaired before they leave. Anything that was done without the landlord's consent has to be removed by the tenant at their own expense, right? So if they put in a carpet in one of the rooms, they are responsible for removing that carpet at their own expense because they didn't get permission to put it in there. Now, if they got permission to put it in there, then the landlord's not going to mind that it's there and it'll be left there. But if they never got permission and the landlord comes and does a walkthrough and sees that there's a carpet now all of a sudden in the bedroom, they're going to require them to take it out and return the room to the way it was. So if it damaged the floor at all, then they're going to have to fix that. Inspections. So if the municipality requires any kind of inspection, the landlord has to be responsible for that. When it comes to COs, like certificate of occupancies, rentals are notoriously more strict than sales. Reason being for the liability, right? So it's the landlord who has to get the certificate of occupancy, but they're a little bit more liable in the sense that they're putting another party in the property. So they're liable for that person's safety. So when you do the COs for rentals, they tend to be a little bit more specific, or I'd say maybe like when you do the sales, right? They usually give you a list of everything they're going to look at. Some towns will stick to that list and go down every single thing. Some towns will be like, oh, you have fire extinguisher, you have smoke detectors, you're fine, and completely ignore the list. When it comes to a rental, they are more likely to go down that list every single bullet, right? Because they have to make sure the tenant's safe. For inspections, the tenant should be getting their own tenant's insurance. That protects their belongings and their property themselves. Now, the landlord should have homeowner's insurance, right? But that's not going to protect anything for the tenant. That's just protecting the landlord's property. One second, I just need to get a sip of water really fast. Okay. So for fires and any other kind of, I guess you could say, bad acts, right? Immediate notice should be given to the tenant by the tenant to the landlord if something happens. So obviously, if their house catches on fire, right, the landlord is going to be notified because they're going to be calling the owner of the property. But if, say, they have like a small kitchen fire and they just one of the cabinets ended up catching on fire and getting damaged, but that's it, right? Nothing that like the entire house burned down. It's the tenant's responsibility to notify the landlord of the situation. If, say, there was a flood, right? Because we're in a very flood zone popular area. If there was a flood, they should be notifying the landlord that something has flooded. If anything else may have happened that would fall under what they call other casualty, they should be notifying the landlord. If, say, part of the property's not able to be in there, like it got condemned because of, say, a fire, right? Then the rent is supposed to be adjusted because they're not going to be in the property. If part of the property is damaged, the landlord is responsible for repairing it, but they have a reasonable amount of time. So depending on the type of damage and how long it would take to fix it, they have that long to do that. They're not obligated to repair or restore anything that the tenants may have done. So if they did put in that carpet, because they got permission to put in that carpet, the landlord doesn't have to put in a brand new carpet. They just have to return it to the way it was when it was rented. If say the property is damaged and they can't be in it, right? Or it can't be repaired within 90 days, the landlord or the tenant has the right to terminate the lease. Just because if it can't be repaired in 3 months, they're going to need to find somewhere to live, right? For those 3 months or potentially longer. So neither one of them are really tied to that then, as long as they agree to void the lease. If say the landlord doesn't have the money to fix it, right? And they know that they're supposed to fix it in a reasonable amount of time, they might say, you know what, we have to cancel the lease because I can't get this done in 90 days. It's going to take me 6 months to do. Let's see. Liability. So liability of the landlord and the tenant. So the landlord's not responsible for any loss or damage to their person or property unless it was caused because of their negligence. So if say in that fire, it was caused because the tenant kept telling the landlord, you know, I keep seeing sparks come out of this outlet. I keep seeing sparks come out of this outlet. I keep seeing sparks come out of this outlet. And the landlord doesn't do anything to fix it. As long as the tenant isn't causing that, then it's the landlord's negligence. Then if the house goes on fire and they lose all of their stuff, then technically they could be liable for the loss of the tenant's property. And I will say this, it is really difficult to prove negligence in court. Just know that. People think it's so easy to prove that, but if you actually look up the terms, the legal terms for negligence, it is very difficult to prove that. So don't let your clients think that that's just going to be an easy thing to prove, because really you're trying to prove somebody's intent, right? You're proving that they purposely ignored something. It's very difficult to prove something like that. The tenant, though, is going to be legally responsible for any loss, injury, or damage to property by their negligence as well. And it works the same way. The landlord has to prove that the tenant was negligent, right? So if say that outlet, it keeps sparking, right? But they never tell the landlord. Well, the landlord wouldn't have known. There's no way for them to know to fix something. And then if the house catches on fire, that's the landlord's tenant's negligence. So it works both ways. You have to be able to make sure that you're alerting the landlord to any potential problems, and the landlord has to make sure that they are taking the responsibility of fixing any of those problems. That way, nobody ends up in a bad situation. Does everyone understand that? Okay. Pets. So the lease just outright says no dogs, cats, or any other pets are allowed on the property without written consent from the landlord, right? So basically, unless you write into this lease that they will allow, you know, 1 25-pound or under dog, or 1 cat, or landlord is okay with any pets, you know, whatever the terms are. Unless you write this, technically, no pets are allowed on the property. Now, if say that they don't have any pets, and then they decide they might want to get a dog, they just have to talk to their landlord. If the landlord is okay with that, then they just need to have written consent. So that's why it's always good to have everything in writing, right? So a landlord should write something up saying that they're allowed to have, you know, whatever pet they're trying to obtain, and they should both be signing it. So that way they have written consent that they can have that pet on the property. When it comes to notices, all notices for the lease have to be given in writing in order for them to technically be effective. So if you just say something over the phone or maybe in passing, technically it doesn't actually take effect. It needs to be in writing. Now, the tenant can't also ignore those notices either. So it's not one of those things where you keep getting a piece of mail and you just pretend it didn't happen, right? They have to acknowledge that they received that notice. Even if they refuse to accept it, it's still considered that it was given. So if a landlord keeps giving them notices, regardless of whether or not they open it or not, it's still been given to them. So they can't just ignore them. It does say that it's best for them to be given by literally handing it to them or by certified mail. If you do certified mail, you can do return receipts. So that way you can have proof that something was delivered. That way they have their way of showing that it was effectively delivered. Let's see. And then when it comes to the landlord, if the tenant needs to give the landlord any kind of notice, that should be done using the address on the lease. So on the lease, they give them the address of where to send the rent, right? That's essentially where they should be sending the notices as well. For waivers, the landlord's failure to enforce any obligation of the tenant contained in the lease shall not prevent the landlord from enforcing them. So if, say, the landlord says no pets, right? We've never had any pets. But then the tenant gets a pet and the landlord doesn't argue with them because they never got written consent. If at some point the landlord decides, you know what, no, you can't have the pet, they technically are still stuck to this lease, right? So then they weren't really allowed to get the pet. So even if they don't enforce certain things for the tenant, this lease is their contract, right? So they are bound to that. So if they decided to go against it without getting any kind of written consent, the landlord can enforce it at any point. Just because maybe they let it go for a little while doesn't mean that they have to let it go forever. Severability. So this is saying basically that if anything in this lease kind of goes against the law, the rest of the lease is unaffected and can continue through binding parties. So whatever is against the law, right, isn't going to survive it. But everything else, as long as those things are legal, are unaffected by the contrary part. The renewal of the lease. So this is when you start putting in the information. So you have to make sure if you're handling the landlord that you discuss this with them, of course, but also make sure that they know what the proper amount of time and notice is, right? Because if you read through that landlord tenant manual, there are considered to be like proper amounts of notification. So for the renewal of the lease, the tenant has to be offered as long as we'll say it this way. The renewal lease has to be offered to the tenant from the landlord, unless the landlord has a good reason not to do so. So for example, if they're a very good tenant and they've done nothing wrong, they've abided by the lease, they've paid their rent on time, they don't break any of the rules, they take care of the property, they follow everything on the above pages, the landlord doesn't really have any good reason to not offer them the renewal. If, say, they're constantly late with their rent, they don't take care of the property, they don't maintain the property, there's garbage everywhere, the lawns are really tall, they're constantly getting yelled at by the town, right, because they're not maintaining the property, well, then the landlord would have good cause to not renew the lease. So when it comes to renewing, what we typically have is that the 60 days before the expiration, the landlord has to notify the tenant if they will be renewing the lease, right? So 2 months before the lease is up. So if the lease is up on March 1st, they have to be told January 1st whether or not it's going to be getting renewed. Within 30 days, go ahead, Debbie.
What if it's a yearly lease or?
Yep, so if it's a yearly lease, what you have is on, I'll just scroll up to figure out what page it's on. I think it's like page 3 or 4, where it says the start date and the end date. Whatever that end date is, it has to be the 60 days prior to that end date.
So what if they only planned on renting it out for a year?
The tenant doesn't have to accept the renewal, right? So if, say, the landlord offers the renewed lease and say, hey, you know what, you've been a really good tenant, do you want to stay another year, right? The tenant doesn't have to stay, They just have to tell the landlord within 30 days whether or not they intend to stay or not. So the same way the landlord has to give them a 60-day notice, they have to give the landlord 30 days notice what their intention is.
Okay. So that the
If
first-
yeah, and it's the same way if they're not renewing it either. If the landlord has no intentions of renewing it, they still have to give them that same 60-day notice that they're not going to renew it.
Okay. Okay. Thanks.
And then when it comes to the lease, they can come up with a whole new, all new terms for the renewal as well. So if say throughout the year, right, they've become really good, they have a good relationship, the landlord and the tenant, right? And before they weren't going to let them alter the property in any way. They weren't going to let them put in a carpet or anything like that or paint the walls. But then when they renew it, they say, you know what, you've been really good. Go put the carpet in there. That can be written in on the new lease. They're allowed to install a carpet, that they're allowed to paint the walls. So they can change the terms because they're going to be making a new lease. Let's see. For furniture, sometimes you guys will have, especially when it comes to like short-term rentals, that they keep like that it'll be furnished, or sometimes it'll be partially furnished, right? So any furnishings that come with the property stay with the property, right? And the same way you have to keep the property in a good condition, they have to maintain the furniture to be in a good condition, right? So they can't destroy the couch that isn't technically their personal property. If say something happens, say there's a tear, then they're responsible for fixing that tear, right? Or if say one of the legs on the dining room chair breaks, they're responsible for fixing that because they're being supplied that by the tenant the same way they're being supplied. I mean, they're being supplied that by the landlord the same way they're being supplied the property. So they have to take care of it. At the end of the lease, right? The same way when you sell a house, the property should be left clean, right? It should be like broom clean. All the tenants' properties should be removed, right? Any of their stuff, they can't just leave a whole bunch of stuff behind. Anything that they damaged needs to be repaired. So if they hung things up, those need to be patched up. The utilities have to do final readings so then they can get like a final payment. And they need to return everything that the landlord gave them. So whether it's keys, garage door openers, any kind of access to the property, all of them need to be be returned to the landlord in the same way that they got it. So if the landlord gave them, 3 keys and 2 garage door openers, then they need to return 3 keys and 2 garage door openers. Section 30 talks about association bylaws, rules, and regulations. So like we were saying, if it's in a condo complex, then the landlord has to provide those bylaws and those rules and regulations to the tenant. So in that way they can abide by them. They can't be held responsible for following them if they've never been provided those. So make sure your landlords are giving them the bylaws and the rules and regulations. So that way they can follow them as stated in section 15, right? Section 15 says they have to follow any rules. Well, the landlord has to make sure that he provides the rules. 31 says that this lease is actually binding. So as soon as they sign it, this is a legally binding contract. Just make sure that they understand that. I know when it comes to sale contracts, because of attorney review and things of that nature, people sign them willy-nilly sometimes and think, oh, I could just easily get out of this because you have the attorneys. The leases are way more difficult to get out of. We actually had a client who they took someone to litigation over it and they got the full rent for the year because the tenant backed out of it. So just be careful, make sure they understand once they sign these things, they are legally binding. Same thing for the landlord. He can't, pick a tenant and then be like, oh, you know what, I don't want them, and go to another one. It's signed, it's a legally binding contract. This 32 says that this lease is the entire agreement. So It's saying that no representations have been made by the real estate broker or the landlord that aren't in this lease. So basically, no like backdoor deals, right? You can't have something that's going to be okay and part of the lease that's not written into the lease. If that's something the landlord and the tenant do outside of you, then you have no control of that. But make sure that you aren't setting up any kind of, shady dealings. And it says that the lease can only be changed in writing. So again, everything has to be in writing. If the tenant wants to do something that maybe they might not have been allowed to do, they need to get it in writing. If the landlord wants to change something, they have to get it in writing. Both parties have to have in writing an agreement to change anything when it comes to the lease. 33, it talks about the attorney review clause. So there is like a little bit of an attorney review when it comes to leases. So the tenants and the landlords do have the ability to have an attorney look at the leases, right? To make sure if the attorney is consulted, he can review the lease and he has a 3-day period, the same way they do with a sale. At the end of those 3-day periods, unless the attorneys are going like back and forth, somebody disapproves of it, you get those disapproval letters when it comes to a sale. Unless the attorneys, one attorney or both attorneys, write a disapproval letter, then this becomes binding after the 3 days. What people get confused sometimes is when to start the counting for the 3 days. So your 3 days start from the day that this lease has been signed and delivered to the tenant and the landlord. Saturdays and Sundays don't count. They don't count weekends, only business days, and they won't count a legal holiday. So if say, it's Thanksgiving, then you're going to be skipping Thanksgiving. You're going to start on Friday, but then you're not going to count Saturday and Sunday. You're going to count Monday. So it'd be Friday, Monday, Tuesday, right? For Thanksgiving. So legal holidays and weekends won't count, only business days. But after those 3 days, that's when it would be binding if an attorney hasn't submitted a disapproval letter. For the notice of disapproval, right? If the attorney for the tenant or the landlord reviews the lease and disapproves it, they have to notify you and any other party in this lease. So that would be, say, the other agent, and then the landlord or tenant, the other party, about the disapproval within that 3-day period. They have to send it by fax, email. They can hand deliver it to you. They overnight mail it. Most times people use email nowadays, right? That's the most common form of delivery, especially because it's the fastest. But every once in a while, you'll see an attorney who might certify mail something to somebody. They also need to inform you guys of any suggested revisions. So the same way they write any kind of attorney review letter, right? We disapprove, we represent the tenant, and we disapprove of this lease. Here are our proposed changes. And then it's usually like a list of whatever they change. It'll say maybe like section 27, instead of blah, 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 we say it should say blah, 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 right? And then they'll go back and forth, and usually they'll get initialed and signed. And once they're signed, then that letter supersedes the lease, the same way the letter supersedes the sale. So whatever changes they made in that letter that got agreed upon, that's the new binding terms of the contract. So, for example, this lease says that no pets are allowed on the property, right? If in that attorney review letter, he writes in there that they will allow a dog up to 25 pounds, a cat up to 15 pounds, and a fish, right? And as long as everybody signs off on that letter, then guess what? They get a dog, a cat, and a fish, right? Because that's the one that supersedes the lease. So you have to make sure too that your clients, whoever is involved, has a copy of that too, those letters, that final letter that's signed off on, because that's going to be the new terms of the lease. Section 34 here breaks down the commissions. It's typical in New Jersey for the landlord to pay the commission. For an annual lease, it's usually half a month's rent to each party. So it's 1 month's rent total. right? And so if you get both sides, you get a full month's rent. If it's two different agents, then it's a half a month's rent, right? And what will happen is when the tenant writes out their checks, they write the security deposit out to the landlord, right? And then the commissions will get written out to the brokerages. So if say it's just you, then it'll get written out to O'Brien Realty for the 1 month's rent. And it has to be a certified check. So it can't be a personal check. The security deposit can be a personal check, but the commissions for that first month's rent have to be a certified check. So just make sure that they understand that they have to go to the bank and get a certified check. If it is two different brokerages, say it's Keller Williams and O'Brien Realty, then one check will be written out to Keller Williams East Monmouth for half the month's rent, and the other check will be written out to O'Brien Realty for half the month's rent. Same thing, have to be certified checks. Make sure you guys have them either take pictures of them, or if they give them to you, you take pictures of them before you send the check off to the other agent, right? So if you're doing it with Keller Williams, someone at Keller Williams East Monmouth, you're gonna mail that check to the office. Make sure you're taking photos of them before you do that, so that way you can upload them into your loop. Scroll down. Section 35 talks about lead-based paint. So the same thing as with the sale, if the property is older than 1978, well, really 1979, that they have to have that lead paint disclosure initialed and signed. It looks a little bit different than the one for the contract, so just make sure you guys use the ones that say lease on them. And make sure you're giving your client the lead-based paint pamphlets. Those are really important, especially for people who have kids, or say people who are a little bit older, right? That's like the target group for lead-based paint. So just make sure that you're giving them to your client. I usually upload them into the loop and share it. You can share it as a PDF and as a viewed document only. All that does is it covers your butt. It shows that you've sent it to them, so they can't say that you never sent it to them. Window guard notification, you'll notice on the contracts now, this is like its own separate page. This has a lot to do with kids as well. That the tenant gives the owner, the landlord, a written request that the window guards have to be installed. They usually are. It's part of like the COs for those things to be in there. So I don't see that this is usually ever an issue for anybody. This is just very standard, especially when it comes to rentals. So this is just saying that the tenant requests that the landlord make sure that these are properly installed as a safety precaution for any children for the property. Megan's Law, everyone understands Megan's Law, that you can't actually provide this information. You can direct your clients on where they can find this information. You can't outright say, oh, you know what, next door there's, convicted sex offender, right? You can't actually say that. You can say, if you want to know where they are, here's the website you can go to look it up. So just make sure that you understand that. There we go. And then, let's see. Okay. 38 is the CIS. So even though we have them fill out a CIS, just in case there's a protection in the leases for it as well. So this is just acknowledging that the landlord and the tenant understand and have received the CIS, and they know the difference between the relationships for the landlord and the tenant, right? And the brokers and the tenant's agents. They understand who's representing who's responsible for telling what information to who. So just make sure you're giving that CIS to your clients. You're explaining the CIS to your clients so they know what your responsibilities are as their tenant's agent or as their landlord's agent. The declaration of licensee relationship. So this is just saying who's representing who, right? So you always go first. O'Brien Realty, obviously, is the name of your firm, and then your name is the licensee representing that firm, and you're representing the tenant's agent. So tenant's agent is always first. Then section B here underneath it, is information is supplied by. So that would be the landlord's agent, right? If it's you, say you're doing both, then it would be dual disclosed agent. But if say you're doing it in cooperation with another brokerage, then you're going to put whatever that is, and they're going to be the landlord's agent. 40 is that truth in renting booklet I was talking about, making sure that you guys share that with your clients. It's really important that you do share that and you tell them to go over it. So many people don't understand what their actual rights are as a landlord or as a tenant. A good example is I had a client who were tenants, right? And the landlord kept giving them bills late. And then they kept getting charged late fees. And they had to keep, and the landlord required them to pay the late fees. And they didn't tell me any of that was going on. If they had told me that was going on, I would have told them, you're not responsible for the late fees. They're responsible to give you that bill on time. If they're not giving it to you on time, it's not your fault, right? And the problem was is neither party read that little pamphlet. So the landlord didn't realize that they couldn't do that. The tenant didn't realize they didn't have to pay that, right? So make sure that your clients know what their actual rights are, what they're responsible for as a landlord or as a tenant. It also just keeps them safe, right? Because if the landlord doesn't know they're supposed to be doing something and the tenant reads that and finds out that they are, they can hold them liable for it, or vice versa. So you got to make sure that they understand, so that way it just covers their butts too. Smoke detectors, carbon monoxide alarms, these are going to be part of the CO. Sometimes they do just fire certs, which is where they only check smoke detectors, carbon monoxide alarms, and fire extinguishers. There is a folder in .loop labeled certificate of occupancies. There's one document in there that only talks about the smoke detectors, carbon monoxide alarms, and fire extinguishers. Has a little diagram, shows you where they're supposed to be in relation to a room. Just print that out and give that to your client, or you can scan, like download it and give that to your client so they understand where they should be, because the state has a regulation on how they should be set up now. For example, smoke detectors, right? They used to be like $5 and you could pop in a smoke detector anywhere and didn't really matter. Now the state requires them to be 10-year sealed batteried, right? So unless it's a hardwired smoke detector, you have to get these 10-year sealed battery ones. They can go anywhere from $15 to $40 a pop, depending on where you buy them from. And that's only like a 2 or 3 year old rule. So most houses haven't updated to that yet, right? So basically every seller who sells usually has to replace all of them. And any landlord is likely going to have to replace them because they haven't been done, if they haven't done it in 3 years, 2 or 3 years. If it's a hardwired detector, right, they just have to be replaced with the hardwired detector. So if, say, the hardwired one is kind of on the fritz, they just have to replace it with another hardwired one. They don't have to change the whole system. So just make sure you kind of go over that document. It's really easy to understand, and that way you can comfortably send it to your clients and show them that it's not that hard. And like I said, that'll be part of the CO, so the landlord essentially will be responsible for that. Private well testing. So I know this isn't too common, but I know every once in a while you guys run into wells, right? That usually, if the water is supplied by the well, then they're going to want to test the water to make sure that it's okay, right? They have to do it within 30 days after within 30 days after receiving the test results. They have to provide the tenant with the report, right? So whatever the results are, they have to give that to the tenant. If the property is for seasonal use, the landlord can post the test results in a location for the property. So for example, if they're doing like summer rentals, instead of giving it to each individual person that's renting it every week, they could have it posted to show, what the results were. That way, whoever, if they're renting it for 4 weeks in July, those 4 different tenants have access to the report. Security cameras. So if there are any security cameras, right? The landlord represents that the cameras will be disabled and not functioning during the lease, unless the tenant has use to the cameras too. So for example, you can't have cameras inside the house and not provide the tenant the access to them to review them. They can have the cameras, and if both parties have access to them, then that's fine. Let's see. Oh, so the bottom part here talks about for if it's like a multifamily. So, you know, if you have like a multifamily building, sometimes there's a shared hallway, things like that, right? Those are excluded from this. So if it's like a common area, like a hallway, the exterior of the building, if it's say there's like a laundry room where there's like a bunch of different laundry machines, things like that, a parking lot or garage, those are excluded. But if it's just a typical house, then it's different. Again, 44 talks about the Megan's Law Registry. It actually gives you the website, so you don't even need to give it to your client. You can just tell them to look at that line. 45, this is the provisions, right? For our leases, this auto populates in. If your landlord or tenant do not agree to this, please make sure you delete it, right? So this is saying that if during the term of this lease or any extension or renewal, so basically if this lease is for a year, but then it gets renewed for another 2 years, that would fall under this rule. A commission shall be paid and divided equally between the brokerages that represented the tenant and the landlord if the tenant purchases the property from the landlord. So basically, this is saying if you brought a tenant and they stayed there for a year and then they decided to buy the property from the landlord, you're due a commission. So is the other party. If say there was 2 brokerages, right? If it was Keller Williams and you, then that agent from Keller Williams is due commission as well, because you 2 brought the parties together. A lot of landlords don't like that, right? So you might have to delete this often. I'm just saying, make sure you explain it. Don't just leave it in there and try to skirt it past your landlord, right? Or skirt it past your tenant. Make sure that they understand that's in there. Some people won't mind because maybe a landlord has no intention of selling the property, right? So what do they care if it's in there? Because they have no intentions of selling it. So just make sure that that's explained. Any other provisions you guys discuss, make sure that they're typed in here, right? Because they need to be as part of the lease. So if there's anything else, any other details that might be in there that aren't included in any of the things up top, make sure that you are typing them in here. They can't just be verbally accepted. They have to be written into the lease. I'm going to say they give you a lot of space to do it because there's even another page to do it if you want to. Then this page here, this is the window guard notification. So it just goes into a little bit more detail about the verification of the window guard, right? So make sure the tenant and the landlord understand what those are. Do you guys have any other questions? If you guys do think of any other questions, anything specific, definitely email John. He has a very vast understanding of the legalities of basically all of these documents. And John is actually a landlord as well. So he really has an understanding of the responsibilities of a landlord and a tenant, things you can do and can't do. So really, if you ever have any questions when it comes to this, definitely utilize his knowledge as a landlord and then just as an educator. But if there's no other questions, I'm gonna stop this now. It's gonna take a little bit to have the recording download. And if you guys want a copy of it, just let me know and I can send it over to you.
I'll take a copy, Jane.
Yeah, no problem.
Thank you. And thank you very much.
You're welcome, guys. I hope that was really helpful for you, and good luck with the rest of your week. Have good weekends. Hopefully stay warm from the crazy snow.
Stay safe out there.
All right, guys. Bye.